Daniel chapter 5. The Balance of Justice. The faith of Nebuchadnezzar was effective in his life, but not in terms of Babylonian history. After that monarch's death, Babylon passed through a succession of weak hands until Nabonidus, son-in-law to Nebuchadnezzar, came to the throne. His son, Belshazzar, Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, was made vicegerent to strengthen his position and to give him independence in extending the empire. Nabonidus's campaign in Arabia led to the establishment of a new capital at Tema, on the highways of the ancient world, to control the trade routes leading to the Red Sea, the Indian Gulf, to Egypt, India, and to all the world of that day. Tema, halfway between Damascus and Mecca, is still a main trade center of interior Arabia, but under Nabonidus, the city reached its glory as the real capital of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, for the king lived there in a palace which equaled that of Babylon. The value of Tema was conditional, however, on the continued power of Babylon itself, in that Nabonidus was on alien ground and able to make the imperial power further effective only insofar as the home base could support him. The reign of Nabonidus thus marked a further development of imperial power as well as its close. The rise of the Medes and Persians, at first a cloud no bigger than a man's hand, developed into a major storm as these powers reached Babylon. The confidence of the Babylonians, however, was based on their ability to withstand, as they believed, a 70-year siege, with the Medes and Persians likely to destroy themselves in time by their distance from home and the problems attendant upon elongated supply lines. Accordingly, Belshazzar felt free to proceed with a religious festival. At the great New Year's festival, only the high priestly king, Nabonidus, could preside, but at other festivals, Belshazzar, as vicegerent, could officiate. The occasion was marked by no small drinking and banqueting, Belshazzar himself presiding at a dinner before 1,000 of his lords, chapter 5, verse 1. The extravagance of splendour and celebration was common to antiquity, as witness the 15,000 who later ate daily at the table of Persian monarchs, according to Athenaeus, and to which Esther chapter 1 verses 3 to 5 gives witness. But the religious motive was central, and basic to the exuberant observances. In affirmation of that religious motive, Belshazzar, a devout man, expressed the official Babylonian condemnation of the recorded dreams of Nebuchadnezzar as interpreted by the Hebrew, Daniel. The sacred vessels from the temple at Jerusalem were brought out so that the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines, chapter 5, verse 3, might drink from them. This was an act of deliberate sacrilege, and also an affirmation of faith. Babylonian faith was 1. A belief in salvation by works, a faith which implies inevitably that 2. Since man saves himself, he controls his destiny, and the future is therefore in his hands. This latter deduction Belshazzar clearly made. His pretended ignorance of Daniel is corrected by Daniel himself. Thou knewest all this? Chapter 5, verse 22. That is, the dreams and experience of Nebuchadnezzar, God's judgments, and the central role of Daniel in all this very well-known sequence of events. Belshazzar, confident of victory over the Medes and Persians, expressed by this sacrilege his defiance of Jehovah and his ability to use him. He was not bound by the dreams or Daniel's prophetic interpretation thereof, but only by his own will and might. As a devout priest-king, giving evidence repeatedly of his faith, this monarch asserted his independence of this discontinuous God, who high-handedly refused man's hand or works, this God who acted in contempt of human glory. It can perhaps be said that in that hour Babylonian religion came into its clearest and sharpest focus in Belshazzar's priestly act. As they drank from the temple vessels, they praised the gods. Chapter 5, verse 4. In that same hour, a man's hand appeared and wrote in the wall in an unknown script, filling all with terror, the priest-king in particular. His own counsellors were unable to decipher the script, in spite of every inducement. The Queen Mother urged the consideration of Daniel, perhaps speaking as though Daniel were unknown to Belshazzar, in order to gloss over the shame of needing a man whose God and whose prophetic interpretations had only an hour before been openly despised and defied. Belshazzar accordingly sent for Daniel, offering him third place in the kingdom, after Nabonidus and himself, for the interpretation of the writing. His comments to Daniel stated in part, "Art thou that Daniel which art of the children of the captivity of Judah, whom the king my father or grandfather brought out of Jewry?" Chapter 5, verse 13. What the Queen Mother had said concerning Daniel had reference to his eminence under Nebuchadnezzar, not to Daniel's origin. Belshazzar chose to pass over that fact, giving every evidence that he knew full well who Daniel was, and to reduce Daniel to silence as far as preaching to him was concerned. He said, in effect, to Daniel, "You're a Jew, brought here as a prisoner years ago. Any eminence you gained was borrowed Babylonian eminence. Remember your place. What can your God offer me, or say to me, when he can do no more for his people?" The offer to make him third ruler in the kingdom, chapter 5, verse 16, was an offer of restoration to an eminence Daniel once possessed under Nebuchadnezzar, and from which, perhaps, for religious reasons, he had since been removed. Daniel's answer was fearless and pointed. "Let thy gifts be to thyself, and give thy rewards, or fee, to another. Yet I will read the writing." Chapter 5, verse 17. Daniel then reminded the monarch of the sovereignty of God, who, quote, gave, end quote, to Nebuchadnezzar all that he possessed, and then deposed him from his kingly throne for a season because of his pride. Chapter 5, verses 18 to 20. Pride here is clearly an aspect of the religion of continuity and is premised thereon. Belshazzar, knowing all this, had deliberately proceeded on a course of contempt for God, a contempt openly manifested in the use of the temple vessels, lifting himself up, that is, setting himself up against and in independence of, the God in whose hands thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways. Chapter 5, verses 21 to 23. The writing on the wall was from this God, and its meaning was clear-cut and direct. Mene, mene, tekel uparsin, or as Young renders it, meaning mene, tekel uperes. The image here is of the scales of justice, that deity of antiquity who appears implicitly or explicitly in one religion after another, in Egypt, Babylon, Persia, Greece, China, and Rome. The scales of justice appear also in the Church of Rome in St. Michael the Archangel, one of whose duties in the life to come is asserted to be the weighing of the souls of the departed on the scales of justice. Père Lachaise, Jesuit confessor of Louis XIV, urged the revocation of the Edict of Nantes as a means of tipping the scales of St. Michael favourably. In every works-based religion, wherever the concept of self-salvation has the slightest foothold, the concept of the scales appears. It is the epitome of self-righteousness and of independence of God, a concept of merits which gains for man an absolution from God and his claims. Now, in conformity to his own creed, Belshazzar is weighed and condemned by the sovereign God. Let a man lower his moral law as low as he will still violate and destroy it. Let him reduce righteousness to bare sincerity, and he will inevitably be a hypocrite. Man cannot justify himself, even in terms of any law he himself creates, because, being a covenant breaker with God, he cannot avoid being a covenant breaker with himself, a creature made in God's own image. Hence, his life is one of radical alienation from not only God and his word, but also from himself, and from any law or order he himself creates. Mene, mene. God has numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances and found wanting. Chapter 5, verse 27. Peres, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Chapter 5, verse 28. In the word Peres, divided, there is an allusion to paras, the word which is translated Persians, which would seem to indicate that the Persians were the dominant power in the dividing or dissolving of Babylon. As a matter of religious and royal dignity, Belshazzar kept his word and exalted Daniel to third office in the empire. Chapter 5, verse 29. That same night, Babylon fell and Belshazzar was slain. Cyrus had diverted the waters of the Euphrates and entered the city, according to his claim, without encounter or battle. Darius the Mede, at the age of 62, became king of Babylon. For the believer, the scales of justice are an impotent concept. Alive in Christ, he is free from the power of sin and death. Living by grace, he is not under the sentence of the law. The cross of Christ is his charter of liberty, the radical alienation of man from God. Man and self is destroyed, and freedom becomes the order of his life, the freedom of the creature, freedom to be a man under God and his vicegerent over creation. But as long as man, whether in religion, politics, or any area of life, tries to play God, he cannot be man or enjoy the liberty, glory, and freedom of man the creature. He inevitably gravitates to a concept of law as the ground of order, as contrasted to the biblical ground of life in Christ. And the law is always a sentence of death. Every law he creates, however minimal, reveals him to be a covenant breaker and law hater, and his every scale, however falsified, registers him nonetheless a condemned man. The law of his life becomes therefore death, while the law of the believer is the life and nature of Christ and a glorious liberty. The law of death, as it works in man, cries out for judgment in the grave, and men invoke and create their own judgments, fashion their hells, and refuse to allow their cultures and histories to be other than a harvest of wrath and a sorry tale of self-punishment. Faced with the destinies they themselves invoke, the Belshazzars of history turn back to their drink and wait for death,